This podcast is sponsored by the animation studio Tonic DNA. Welcome to the Story-Driven Arts Podcast, where the visual arts and storytelling come together. I'm your host, Todd Schaefer. My guest today is the legendary film designer Armand Baltazaar. Armand has worked on numerous animated features from Dreamworks Prince of Egypt to Pixar's Inside Out, and Armand has recently released a novel that he both wrote and illustrated. The book is called Timeless, and the movie rights have been purchased by a major studio, and an A-list director has been attached. I first met Armand when I was new to the animation industry. He was teaching a painting course at a school called Associates in Art in the LA area, and I had the joy of studying under Armand. This is episode 2. You went to Art Center, and that was, what years was that?
I think that was from 85 to 89.
Okay, that was before my time there, because I went there in the late 80s, 89, I think.
Oh, right. You must just miss each other.
Yeah, but I was taking more evening classes. I was already out working.
Okay.
But I studied under Steve Houston, which you must have done as well.
Yeah, he's one of my good friends.
Are you going to teach for his New Masters Academy?
I might. The thing is that my whole world has kind of been thrown, into a maelstrom. I'm sort of in this kind of new thing in like writing and illustrating books. It was not that working on movies isn't hard. It is, but it's a much more demanding of my time than I thought it was going to be. So I sort of need to figure out how to find a way that I can sort of incorporate other passions I have, and one of them is teaching. And so I'm looking at doing that further down the road.
Oh, that's cool. That would be great.
Was Bern Hogarth still around when you were there?
No, he was not.
Okay. Oh, that's a bummer. I think I was one of the last classes that had him. He was really quite the character. Him and Harry Carmian. Was Harry still there when you were? Yeah.
No, Harry wasn't there. In fact, Steve Houston's mentor, what was his
Wilson.
name? Vern Wilson.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had just left and he was doing his own thing.
All right. Yeah, that's cool. Very cool.
Yeah. So from Art Center, what happened? How did you get into the industry?
Well, that's a funny story. So here's the thing. I went to Art Center, and I'd studied previously at another college and learned how to do advertising illustration and hated it. Went to Art Center to learn how to be a book illustrator. I wanted to write my own stories and illustrate them and do book covers and that whole sort of thing. And so I was taking a lot of fundamental classes. I was sneaking into classes that had to do with illustration for narrative, kind of ends. And back then, when I was at Art Center, the internet wasn't what it is. You couldn't just get feedback from anybody on your work. And back then, if you wanted feedback on how your work was outside of your teachers, you would have to cold call an art director or send them a letter, an inquiry, and hopefully get an interview. Or it was really tough to meet with professionals in the industry to find out what your work was. And so when I was halfway through Art Center, I was fourth term, I decided that I was going to find a way to get people to look at my work and get some feedback. And every term, as you know, there's a graduating class, they have a graduation show, and they invite industry professionals to look at their work. And I knew this was coming up and the end of my fourth term. And what I thought was, at the time, when they were doing the grad show, the illustration majors would present their work on this long hallway, by the transportation department at the back of school. And they would have drinks and they have all this stuff set up. And so I took it upon myself to get into the school at about 2 a.m. And I took 10 to 12 of my best pieces, and I walked past the grad show at the end of the hall where the men and women's bathroom was, and I taped my artwork to the wall around the bathroom. And then I showed up at the graduation ceremony at the grad show, dressed up like one of the wait staff in a white shirt and black pants, and I hung out next to the bathroom. And my idea was this: they were giving these guys drinks, coffee, champagne, the whole works. All these art directors and creative directors walk up and down the hall, look at the artwork. And if you weren't a student, they would actually talk out loud what they thought of the artwork. And I knew this from going to other past grad shows. So I stood around the bathroom acting like I was the help, to eavesdrop on what these art directors were saying about my work when they walked by. And it so turned out that one of the people who ended up seeing my work was a art director for the brand new um, Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg company, DreamWorks, who had come to do a talk at the grad show and was walking around. My work got spotted, and I was asked to come in for an interview. And so I yeah, it was complete. I mean, it was unexpected. I just wanted to hear if people thought my work was good or what I should improve, and I ended up getting an interview, and they said, you know what, I kind of came clean and said I wasn't a graduating student. I'm only halfway through school. I just wanted to get feedback, and they sort of laughed at that, and they said, well, look, can you pull your pieces off the wall, put it in something halfway decent, and come down to DreamWorks and have an interview. And so I pulled my stuff off and I went in, and and they offered me a job as a background painter. And so what I ended up doing was I told them I didn't want to quit school, so I made a deal with them, that I would finish the next 4 semesters of school, but half of the week I would work at DreamWorks, and then a full time job was waiting for me on graduation day. So for the
Wow.
rest of my 4 terms, I worked at DreamWorks part time as a background painter, and then a little bit in layout. And then when I graduated, I started working full time as a background painter on Prince of Egypt.
That is
That's how it
brilliant,
happened.
Armand. That is brilliant. I've never heard of anyone doing that, but man, what a brilliant idea.
Well, the thing is, I wasn't trying to get a job, and what ended up happening afterwards is they had to make a rule. They checked all the hallways, and they made sure no one ever did that after me. You know, um, but it just had the novelty of never having been tried. No one ever thought to try that before.
Yeah. Well,
But
yeah, that's amazing that you wanted the feedback so much that you just put it up there and you were on a fly on the wall to hear what they might say, good, bad, or ugly, you know?
yeah. Well, the thing is this. I mean, Art Center has a lot of brilliant teachers, and there were lots of teachers in the industry. But at the time, back in, from when I went into school there, from 85 to 89, animation, entertainment design, those things were not the they were not what they are now. They weren't
Yeah.
an integral part of the illustration department. Back then it was still advertising, editorial, maybe some book. That was kind of an offshoot of editorial.
Yeah.
And so the only guys doing entertainment like stuff were the transportation guys. you know,
Yeah.
the guys that were
That's
like, I'm
right.
going to be Sid Mead, kind of
Right.
thing. And so if you were just taking straight illustration classes, I mean, you might get in a class with like Gary Meyer, who did entertainment work and be like, oh yeah, and give you some guidance. But there was nothing really specifically geared towards that. And so, I mean, I didn't know that I wanted to go into animation, but I did know that other people in the industry, who weren't doing advertising or editorial, their feedback would be beneficial. And I knew a lot of them happened to be art directors for animation and publishing and all these other various other areas. So I thought, why not get a fresh set of eyes, on what I did,
Wow.
you know?
So at DreamWorks, you worked on Prince of Egypt. Was that
Yes.
the first project you worked on?
Yeah, that was the very first movie I ever worked on. When people always ask me, what's your favorite movie? Um, Strangely enough, it's the first and last movies I've ever worked on. Those are I count those as a single best movie experience. Um, so working on Prince of Egypt, it was fantastic because we were working with so many brilliant people in animation that wanted to sort of prove themselves, wanted to do something different. And this was a company being held by Steven Spielberg, who wanted to make the first movie out of the gate this labor of love. Prince of Egypt was his labor of love. And so he kind of charged us and empowered us to make a Lawrence of Arabia kind of movie in animation, which no one had ever really attempted to do. And so um, it was an amazing kind of circumstance of being able to work with all these great people and to work with Steven Spielberg on something that he really loved. Like it was a personal thing. And then the last movie I worked on was Inside Out, which was with Pete Docter at Pixar. And the thing is that Inside Out was kind of a Valentine, a love letter to Pete's daughter,
Oh,
and it was this thing where I started my career, at least so far, I mean, in animation, with somebody whose movie was a passion project, and then the last one I worked on until I transitioned into book was again another director whose film was clearly a passion project, and to work with that kind of energy was it was amazing.
wow. And you've worked on a lot of other films in between those two.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I think like with just DreamWorks alone, I worked on let's see, Prince of Egypt, The Road to El Dorado, Sinbad, Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron. I worked on the B movie. I worked on Flushed Away, and then I worked a little bit on what would become Monsters versus Aliens, which at the time was called Rex Havoc. And then I worked on 3 films at Disney. Worked on 2 films with Robert Zemeckis, and then I worked on Cars 2 and Brave, The Good Dinosaur, a film called Newt, which never got released from Pixar, and then Inside Out. So
Wow.
it's been a really amazing and fun adventure.
I can imagine. That's incredible, all those films. And you, being in the background department, didn't really suffer under the change from 2D to 3D like so many others did.
Well, the thing is, I mean, there was suffering. I mean, to tell you the truth, when the computer came, we were all fighting it, and it came as early as Prince of Egypt, believe it or not. Um, when we were working on Prince of Egypt, we had hundreds upon hundreds of backgrounds that needed to have hieroglyphs, especially in Egypt, on walls. And so for the first few, I would say 20 or 30, we would painstakingly paint in each darn hieroglyph that appeared on a wall, and it was amazingly, just time consuming and just nerve wracking. And finally, one of the graphic designers said, we could do that with computer graphics. We can do this in Photoshop. And Photoshop was still, I think it was like Photoshop 2.
Wow.
So back
Wow.
then, and so it was very bare bones, hammer and nails kind of version of
Right.
Photoshop. But we're like, no, we don't want to use a computer. That's cheating. And then all of a sudden we started using it to start putting in our hieroglyphs. I'm like, oh, this is all right. This is not so bad. And but still we fought it. And then Road to El Dorado came, and you know Photoshop got a little bit better. And one of the things they were really pointing out to us was, it's a painstaking process with background paintings when, for example, the director decides he's going to change an entire sequence from day to night or night to day or something like that. That's that dramatic, and you basically have to go in and repaint every single background when there's a change in time of day. And we started finding that we were using Photoshop to make changes when the director wanted changes in a much more sort of efficient, painless way. And so finally, slowly, we're like, all right, it's not so bad. It's not so bad. And then computer graphics came, like CG modeling, and we all fought it too. We're like, no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this. And then it was what ended up happening though, at least it, from my perspective and experience, is that I went from background painting to layout and doing layout design. And when we transitioned into CG, background painters and layout artists started to kind of merge together in this weird hybrid, which would later become the art department, in the way that art departments are set up for CG animation now, where you had to sort of be a master of all trades. You had to be able to draw, you had to be able to design, you had to have some awareness of camera and staging and composition and cutting and all the rest. And I started finding that when I would design a set, in the old days, you would just use pencil and paper to do drawovers to sort of help the layout artist kind of get things on model or get things where they need to be. And once there was this process where you had to sort of hand off your drawings to people who were modeling them that were maybe fantastic technical artists, but not necessarily had the training for design, had the training for composition, for all these other things that came out of being in layout and being in backgrounds. That it became beneficial to just learn how to use these CG tools so that when somebody kicked back a model to you, you could essentially do a tracing paper kind of guide or correction by taking their model and moving things around and shifting it and kind of illustrating what it is that you need or is needed for the camera. And it just ended up becoming a real useful tool for the guys that were traditionally trained. So, long story short, it was painful, moaning, groaning, screaming, kicking, scratching, but then finally, acceptance in the end.
Yeah. Would you go back
To 2D?
to painting on board and gouache and all that stuff that you used to use?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I
Yeah.
do it for myself. I mean, the thing is, it would really. It's one of those things where I would kind of look at. Actually, I would use sort of like like Pixar's kind of motto of things, right? Everything has to serve the story. Everything has to serve the storytelling and serve what you're trying to accomplish with the people who are you're telling the story to. And so for me, it's that. And so if I can get it better in paint, I want paint. If I can, for them, if it comes down to if I'm doing something for the audience, that's what I'm going to do. Um, because in the end, I think that as a storyteller, that's your greatest gift, right? And all your tools with drawing, painting, composition, putting down the paint, all these things, at least when you're telling that story in animation, is you want them to be just completely captivated in. So I'm up for using whatever I need to do to make the best experience for the person receiving the story.
Right.
But if they want to come and look at some awesome artwork, I'm going to take out my pencil, I'm going to take out my paint, and I'm going to give it to them.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me, explain for a student in school, what is the role of the background artist in terms of serving the story, other than just
Well,
recreating some location?
right. Background and environment design, I'm going to kind of fuse them all together as one thing, you know, is something that's interwoven all throughout the story, right? And I'm gonna
Yeah.
use a couple of different examples of things. So, like when you watch a movie and you're listening to a soundtrack, the soundtrack is painting an emotional picture for you, right? Of what the characters might be feeling, or what
Right.
the audience might be feeling, or what might be the tone and emotion of whatever is happening before them, right?
Right.
And so it's being done with notes, it's being done with rhythm, it's being done with all these instruments, and it's being presented to you, right? The actors are acting and they're telling you the story through what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're feeling. When I think about what an environment is, what a background is, it is the visual complement to the actors, the
Right.
animation. And for me, what it is doing is it's not simply being a backdrop. So when a character goes into the room, a background painter or designer or both has crafted the environment that is integral to whatever is being told. Like for example, if you go into a bedroom of a character, you're not going into a bedroom and it's got a bed and it's got chairs and there's books in it, and let's say it's a kid's room, there's some toys and things. What you're doing is you are crafting a portrait of a person through the objects, through the space, through the choice of colors and textures. And when that character is acting in that space and telling you the story, it feels one to one, that the space is conveying the kind of emotion in the story of the
Right.
character. Let's say it's not a person's room; it's just a place. It's a battlefield, right? Well, the thing is that let's say the battle has three parts: the beginning of the battle, the height of the battle, the conclusion of the battle, right? It
Yeah.
all is one place. However, the background designer, the background painter, through designing the actual landscape, through sort of showing the viewer what to look at in any point in the story, can change the design, can change the lighting and the color to sort of bring out the storytelling. And so that's what I sort of look at as the role of a background painter and designer. They're basically crafting the an emotional storytelling space that complements the animation.
That's really a great way to put it. It's sometimes it's complimenting, sometimes it could even be counterpoint, right? It could
Oh
be
yeah.
against what's actually happening there to create some contrast. And
Yes.
um,
Yes.
yeah, and you're sort of like part of the cinematography department in a live action shoot. You know, the cinematographers where they're lighting everything and making sure the framing is proper and it's suiting the story.
Yeah. Absolutely. At least for me, a big part of what I do or what I did or occasionally will do on a freelance basis is to come in and do um, story moment sort of visuals. I'll also do color scripting or color keying,
Right, right,
which is very much right about that, which is sort of like kind of helping to craft the experience through the lighting and the color
right.
kind of thing, and
Exactly.
working really, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, you got to work with some incredible people that just, I'm sure, have had an incredible influence in your development.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So, if
I've been very very fortunate.
yeah, so are there some moments in your career where you suddenly had this explosive amount of growth because you had some experience or you had some particular feedback or you learned something that just took you to another level very quickly? Or
Yeah,
was it just a long, slow progression?
it's a little of both. And the thing is that it's I don't want to kind of like how I ended up in animation isn't atypical. My path in animation was very, very sort of similar to that. When I started as a background painter, what sort of usually happens in traditional 2D, or at least back in the 80s when I was still doing, excuse me, not 80s, the 90s when we were doing traditional, is that you would sort of start out as a trainee as a background painter, and then you would be like an apprentice, and then you become a journeyman. And on your road from an apprentice to journeyman, you would start doing more things than just background painting. So you would start doing lighting keys, or more importantly, color keys in the background department. And then you would start to learn how the bigger pieces would fit together.
Hmm.
Now, usually there were guys in animation that would be typical of their career. They would sort of move to from being somebody who started painting backgrounds to somebody who was painting color scripts and color keys to then becoming background supervisors. What ended up happening with me was halfway through my background career, I wanted to be the guy who was designing the environments that the background painters wanted to paint. So I started splitting my time working half the week in one department. When I'd wrap up my painting, I would go to the layout department and work on a layout and start my training as a layout artist. And I went back and forth between the two departments. And why that's atypical is because it ends up being a real big headache, and most people don't do it. They take more of a straighter path. But I'd always had this thing in me where if I was really curious about wanting to acquire a skill, I'd be willing to sort of do what I thought it was needed. And a lot of times I remember senior background painters going, you know what, you're slowing down your growth as a background painter, on your way to being a senior background painter. But I'm like, yeah, but you know what, I've got my whole lifetime to get there. If I have an opportunity to learn, I'm going to try and learn, and and so while I was working in the layout department, you would have to draw in the characters for the layout, just to know
Yeah.
placement, to know staging, you'd have to workbook these sort of things. And it went back to one of my original loves when I was in school, which was character design and character and figure work. And so I started asking if I could do some figure design or character design while I was in my time in layout. So they would toss me in some character work, and so I started incorporating character design into my workflow, which again kind of held me back in both departments. I wouldn't get further along, but I'm like, I have this chance to study with all these great character designers. I'm going to take it. So I didn't take anything that was too typical, but I think for me, it's always that I had the bigger picture in mind. Was I had a feeling that I wanted to become a certain kind of artist, and by taking all these sort of like I don't want to say side roads, but I guess they were sort of adjacent paths along the way. it ended up helping me further in the end.
So, who are some of your painting influences?
Would you like to know living or dead?
Uh, Either one.
Okay, I'll kind of rattle off a few. There were you know when you're a student and through your career as a professional, you sort of discover different people at different times in your life when you sort of want to learn something from a particular master. So I'll sort of start with
Yeah.
the old masters. But I remember when I went to art center, I had never really heard of the impressionist painters like John Singer Sargent or
Right.
of William Merritt Chase.
Right.
I'd heard of people like Degas and Monet and Renoir, but the thing is that I had no idea that there was a group of impressionists who were so strongly grounded in draftsmanship and sort of painting in the way that they were painting.
Right.
And I would say that when I discovered them, I was blown away. So
Yeah.
my like early on when I discovered painting, like really, really painting, Sargent had become huge for me. Velasquez had been huge, and William Merritt Chase, and a lot of the sort of American impressionists had a profound impact on me as painters. And then um, I discovered color theory with Joaquin Sorolla, the
Yeah.
famous Spanish master, who
Yeah.
completely blew me away. And
Oh, brilliant.
when I was at school, and studying like you had studied with Steve Houston, I had a chance to study with Steve's mentor, Dan McCaw, a little bit, and it was eye opening because it's sort of that between Steve and Dan McCaw, there was this initial introduction to the Russian Impressionists, which I
Right.
think was massive, uh, sort of eye-opening thing, to sort of discover Nikolai Fechin and Ilya Repin and Valentin Serov and all these guys and Arkhipov and wouldn't you know it, when I got hired at DreamWorks, one of the background painters that became the background supervisors was a guy named Ron Lucas, who studied with the Russian master. I'm totally spacing out now with late Saturday afternoon. But it was basically Dan McCaw's teacher. Yeah, the Russian guys were massively influential on me. But here's the thing that was what was really interesting. Along the same token, I was discovering the American illustrators. When you're a kid growing up, of course you know about Norman Rockwell, right?
Yeah.
But I had no idea guys like Dean Cornwell. I had no idea about guys like Saul Tepper. I had no idea, not really, about guys like J.C. Leyendecker
Right.
or like Alphonse Mucha, right? And so I was bombarded in school with all these illustrators that had sort of come from this rich tradition
Yes.
that completely blew me away. And I remember I hit this crossroads point in terms of um, painters and illustrators. I mean, for the longest time when I was a student, I was like, I want to be John Singer Sargent. Not likely, but that was a lofty goal to aspire to. But then I had a few like, painting shows with other artists and stuff. And the thing that was funny was I was painting portraits of my friends, like trying to do like John Singer Sargent portraits. And I found myself like liking what I was doing. I was loving it, but it was I didn't feel satisfied for some reason.
Yeah.
And then I remember one day, I think it might have been Steve who even showed me. He showed me a painting by Edwin Austin Abbey, and it was one of his Shakespeare pieces, like the ones hanging in the Met Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was of King Lear, and it was this massive thing with all these figures and stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, this guy, he totally blew me away. And I remember reading about Edwin Austin Abbey and finding out that he was best friends with Sargent, and Sargent even saying to Edwin Austin Abbey, who was successful and prolific, a Sargent said to him that you could become even more successful and more affluent if you paint portraits like I do, for high society, and instead of being a book illustrator. And Abby said, that's awesome, and you are awesome at it, and I do like doing that, but I love doing what I do. And that's sort of like a switch went off in my head. And this was happening while I was working on Prince of Egypt, that I realized, man, I like telling stories with my paintings. not just painting beautifully, but actually the act of when they look at the image, there's a story being told. And I think that that was a big aha moment. It's because at that moment it was took Edwin Austin Abbey, but then it made me go back and look at the great illustrators, the great American illustrators and European illustrators, and it made me realize that when I made images like that, I felt like a kid again. When I was trying to emulate Sargent, I never felt like a kid. I felt like,
Right.
oh my gosh, I always felt like I was in the shadow of the master, trying to be like the master. You know what I mean? Like,
Wow.
oh, I have to be like the master. But when I would do something that was telling a story, it was like I was opening up a copy of Spider-Man again, and reading about the
Yeah.
adventure, or
Right.
more importantly, Treasure Island, like NC Wyeth, and fighting the pirates. I'm like, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what I love. It took
Wow.
me a long time, but that was the aha moment in terms of finding painters that had a profound impact on me.
I had a very similar experience because I left animation because I got burned out of advertising because most of the stuff I was doing was advertising, and I wanted to go
Right.
paint. And Sargent was one of my big painters, and like you, I discovered Sargent at Art Center and Soroya and Ender Zorn and P.S.
Oh
Croyer and all
yeah.
these guys, and Arkhipov. By the way, have you ever found a book on Arkhipov?
Oh my gosh. No, not really. I mean,
Because
I
I've
find
looked.
right. It's well, the guy Ron Lucas I studied with,
Yeah.
and also was the guy that Dan McCaw studied with, and he was a Russian painter. That was if I get the story right, the student of Ilya Fechin. And I remember asking Ron, I go, how come there are no books on Arkhipov? And he goes, well, Arkhipov was one of the best of the Russian impressionists, and then he pissed off the communist government.
Oh
He
no.
pissed off the communist government, and they sent him to Siberia
Oh
to live in exile. And the thing is, so if if you look at the famous Russian impressionists, they're all like painting the most important people of Russia,
yeah.
kind of thing. And then occasionally they'll
Yeah.
paint peasants. And then if whatever stuff you find of Arkhipov, it's always just the peasants.
That's right.
And you come to find out, like, oh, it's because he was exiled to
Wow.
yeah, out in the boondocks, and he was like in disgrace. And that's why you only find his stuff in collected works of Russian impressionists, like a catalog. He'll be like
Yeah.
one or two images, but
Oh,
never a complete. Yeah,
that's a
that
sad
horrible.
story.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So yeah, you're one of the few people I've ever heard talk about Arkhipov. I've always loved Arkhipov, but never been able to
Yeah,
find
me
much of it.
too.
Anyhow, so
It's
so I sort of fell into the Sargent thing where I thought, I'm going to develop my painting skills by doing portraits, and I got involved in
right.
the Portrait Society of America, and so I was spending half my year pursuing art and then half my year pursuing animation just to keep the bills paid. And I didn't really want to do portraits. I was only doing it to develop my skills because I wanted to do more genre paintings, more narrative kinds of work. And
Right.
it just, I realized after the fact, a few years later, that portrait work just sucked the life out of me and kept me from being able to do what I wanted to do. So the
Oh,
few years I had where I devoted to portraiture were almost a complete waste for me in that sense. And I realized through that I what I really missed was the moving image, and I wanted to get back into animation and stuff.
right.
But yeah, it's
No, I hear you.
very similar lesson learned, but the hard way.
Well, the thing is that there are guys that do that, that love it, and it's just more power to them because
Yeah,
the only thing that happened to them is the exact same thing that happened to us. They found what they loved, and then
yep,
they started doing it, you know.
that's right.
And so you went into advertising, I went into advertising. I'll tell you, when I went into advertising, in part it was to sort of make my Asian parents happy, because they were like, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be a businessman. I'm like, no, I'm gonna do art. And so they took a breath, like, art. Hmm. Okay, well, if you're gonna do art, do advertising. Like, they understood advertising. You know what I
Wow.
mean? They
Huh.
because like, oh, you make art and then you sell things with your art, and that makes money. Like they equated it to business, kind of thing. And let me just
Wow.
back up a second. So the thing is when like my parents were Filipino immigrants, and Philippines was a very in the '60s. I mean, still very kind of a poor country, but back then it was a very poor country. And if you had the chance to go to college, you were expected to do something that immediately gave back to the community. And so things like being a doctor, a lawyer, a business person, these were the sort of things that culturally was ingrained in Filipinos. And so when they came to this country, they sort of had the same sort of mindset. It's like you have to do something that will immediately benefit people, like that they could, quantify. And so advertising, they thought, oh, okay, that makes sense. But I remember doing it, and oh my God, I hated it. And the thing is, I grew up in Chicago, and the kind of advertising they did there was even worse because it was product advertising. So I spent the first couple of years out of not Art Center, the college I went to before, I was illustrating Oscar Mayer wieners, and Heinz 57 sauce, and it was that,
Wow.
I remember working at this ad agency, and they're like, and I was just drawing hot dog after hot dog, hamburger after hamburger. And I met this guy who had been there for like 20 years, and he was doing a sexy car illustration. And he goes, yeah, maybe after 10 years, I'll give you a sexy car illustration. I'm like, going, oh my God, I can't do this.
Wow.
And I dropped out,
That's incredible.
Yeah. But you found what you found it. You found what you loved.
Yeah, I did the hard way. But, I guess you learn, you pull from all kinds of things and develop.
Right.
Growth as an artist. My interview with Armand will continue in the next episode. Armand's book Timeless has 4.9 stars out of 5 at Amazon with almost 100 reviews. It's been endorsed by Ridley Scott, Pete Docter, James Gurney, and Brenda Chapman. The story is a fun read and is chock full of illustrations. It can be purchased at most bookstores, and you'll find a link to it and to Armand's website in the show notes of this episode. This has been the Story Driven Arts Podcast. For more resources, visit our website at storydrivenarts.com. Tonic DNA is an animation studio based in Montreal. We're always on the lookout for talented artists to join our team who are committed to artistic excellence. You can find Tonic on the web at tonicdna.com. The music is by Lee Rosevear.